Okay, so here's a quick kind of summary of some of the ethical issues that researchers come across. And I've just got a few minutes to talk about this, so I'm not going to go into anything in great detail here. From my point of view, there is an underlying principle, if you like, in the ethics of research, which is that on the one hand, there are dangers, problems, ethical kind of safeguards that you have to bring into bear. On the other hand, there is the benefit that comes from doing research. Now, that benefit comes from a variety of sources. Principally it comes from our understanding about the world. The more we understand the world, the better we can make it, and so on. So, that's the real reason for doing research, and that's why you have to publish, because you have to, somehow get out what you found. But there are other benefits too. Sometimes the people themselves can benefit from it. Sometimes you can benefit from it. You'll get a degree out of it and things like that. So there is a benefit there as well. So there are benefits to doing research, and you balance one against the other. So any ethical dilemma is always the balance of the harm that research might do against the benefits we might get from it. Which means that we can do some pretty awful research to people if we think that we're going to get good benefits from it. And on the other hand, sometimes certain kinds of research should not be done because there's hardly any benefit from it at all that we can see. So there's no justification for even a fairly harmless thing. A good example of that, most of all, would be in something like medical research, where a treatment might actually threaten someone's life. Now, of course, they have to get their permission for it. They have to, we don't do it on them without telling them. They volunteer and so on. But we might tell them that there's a chance of dying from this. But the benefits are so great if we have a new treatment that we can justify that threat that's going on. And if the people volunteer, they'll know, well, okay, yes, that's true, but at least I'll get the treatment and that might help me, and so on. So bear in mind, there's always that kind of balancing act between the two sides. Now, the way I've laid this out is to go through a list of suspect activities, things to be wary of, but beware that you can always balance those against the benefits from doing the research, that it doesn't rule out things. These are not things you can't do. These are things which you have to be careful about and maybe control in some way, and always think about that balance with the benefits of research. So, first of all, involving people without their knowledge. Now, last week we looked at ethnography, and we saw how a lot of ethnography has been done covertly. So, of course, people don't know they're being researched, but we can justify that for other reasons. It's the only way of doing it, it's the only way you can get information and so on. But the starting point is that people should know that they're being researched, so they should have fully informed consent and so on. But, of course, as I said before, that's not always an issue. If you're observing people in a crowd or in a public setting, it's a public setting. People are used to being observed. So why can't you do the research just by going along? And there's no reason why not. So you don't always need informed consent. If people are normally being observed anyway, that's not a big issue. But in a lot of cases, it is. Okay, secondly, coercing people. You shouldn't coerce them into doing your research. And I think, again, this is probably quite a strong one. It's hard to think of occasions when you can coerce. But there might be. Might be certain situations of perhaps psychological testing where you've got to perhaps fool people into doing something without their realising that that's what they're doing. But we find out in the end some really interesting things as a result of that, and we can justify it. One particular issue here, perhaps for people like me, is not coercing students by giving them credits for doing it. Take part in my research and you'll get credits to your degree for having taken part in your research. That's a kind of coercion, really, to those who are involved, the participants. To try and involve that kind of thing. But there's no reason why you can't offer a bit of money, perhaps, to people, or give kind of rewards, certificates and coupons and things like this to people who take part in your research. It's taken up their time after all, so in a sense you're paying for their effort and time in helping you. Don't withhold information about the true nature of the research. In general, you should tell people what you're doing and why you're doing it and who's paying for it and so on. That's the norm. But just sometimes you can't do that because it will destroy the whole question you're asking. And the most famous one is the Milgram Experiment, a famous experiment done many years ago now by a psychologist called Stanley Milgram, who was looking at whether people would act act against what they would normally do if they were persuaded by a figure of authority. So if some authority figure told them to do things, would the people then act in ways that they would normally find abhorrent, unethical, and so on? And he found yes, they would. And the authority figure for him was a scientist, someone in a white coat, and he got people to give electric shocks in an experimental setting to other people, eventually to a level that would definitely have killed them had they been real people and real shocks. In fact, the whole thing was set up.
Nice one. Tame. Wolf, bear, dog, cat. Wrong. Answer is bear. 240 volts. Next one. Sweet. Nice.
No, you go back up to the beginning of that page and go through it again until he's learned them all correctly.
Oh, no. No, I'm not going to kill that man. You mean I got to keep going up with the scale? No, sir. He's hollering in there. I'm not going to give him 450 volts.
The experiment requires that you
I know
continue.
it does, but that man is hollering in there, sir.
As I said before, although the shocks may be painful,
Yeah,
they're not
but
dangerous.
I mean, he's yelling in there.
Start with blue, please, at the top of the page. Continue, please, teacher.
Okay, other things. Don't otherwise deceive participants. This is the problem about all kind of covert research is you're deceiving participants. But like I say, very often it's impossible to do the research the other way. And sometimes we need to find these things out. And not telling people what's going on is the only way you can do that sometimes. Important, the text following indicate a reaction. An important kind of measure really of whether people have been disturbed by having covert research done on them is, are they upset about it? So, and a common procedure here is to debrief people. If you fooled people about what you're doing, then you should debrief them afterwards. In other words, tell them what's gone on, tell them the reactions are normal and so on and so forth, and they're not to be upset by it, etc. And often that's enough to put people back to a normal keel again. And you can go to the extent of offering counselling and so on and so forth, but I mean that's very rarely needed. We're not in those kind of areas most of the time. That's not an issue. But nevertheless, debriefing can be very useful for helping the people see that they've got something from it, even though they were deceived about it to begin with, and of course to help you as well, perhaps design things better, to get some feedback on what went on. You shouldn't induce people to commit acts diminishing their self-esteem and so on, making a fool of themselves. People do that anyway, of course. It's a natural part of life. People occasionally do that. But you shouldn't force them to do that anyway. And if you have to, in some way, make them look foolish, then you certainly should be debriefing and offering support afterwards and so on. But it's one, beware of doing that. Violating the code of self-determinism. This is particularly a problem in studies of individual change, where you're helping people do things differently. People should be able to determine what they want to do with their lives and what they want to do with their actions and so on. But if you're manipulating them in certain ways, they may be unable to do that. But it might be good for them to do that. Think about what would normally be seen as a good program, a program to help people stop drinking too much alcohol. Now, of course, the mechanisms and manipulations you might use might go beyond this self-determinism. People may say, well, you're manipulating me, you're making me do things I wouldn't otherwise do. That's true, but of course the final outcome is we hope good. We're finding out how we can help people, over drinking, becoming alcoholics and so on. So, behaviour modification where people don't give consent is perhaps a problem here, but you can justify that in terms of the greater good. Exposing people to mental and physical stress and risks, doing risky things, mentally risky, physically risky, and so on. One measure here that's useful is, do people normally do those things anyway? So, in other words, what I'm saying here is, if you want to do a a study of rock climbers, for example. There's no reason why you can't. Rock climbers rock climb anyway. It may be dangerous, they may have accidents and so on, but that's their choice, they're doing it anyway. So by doing your research, you're not adding to the risks they're taking. They're already taking those risks. You're simply being there, unless of course you do something silly like try to interview them while they're actually on the rock face and distract them, then you are adding to the risk. But in other ways you're not doing that. So that's not to say you can't research things that are risky, but you shouldn't normally be adding to the risk. So your research itself shouldn't increase the risk in any way or create new risks. You shouldn't invade people's privacy, but again, that's not always possible to avoid that. You might say any kind of research is actually asking people about things that are private. But of course, invading privacy is quite different from simply asking questions. People have the ability to say, no, I don't want to answer that one. That's fine. They should have that right to refuse answers, to skip sections and so on. And they should know they have that right as well. That's, again, part of the informed consent, is they have a right to stop at any point and not go further. Withholding benefits from some participants, if you don't answer these questions, you won't get the prize at the end, that kind of thing. You shouldn't obviously manipulate in that kind of way. Not treating people fairly, with consideration or respect. I mean, these are humans. We don't normally do it anyway, so why should we do that in research? Treat people, they're people, treat them fairly, with respect and so on. And lastly, discouraging people with withdrawing before the end of research. I mean, a real problem here with research often is people wanting to withdraw, and you want to keep them in. Well, there's a very kind of difficult balance here. Of course you can try and persuade them to stay with you, but in the end they have the right to withdraw if they want to, not to carry on. There could be very good reasons why they don't want to carry on, in which case you've got to respect that. On the other hand, that doesn't mean, say, you just cave in. You can argue your case. You can say, look, it's not as bad as you think. It's only going to be another 10 more minutes or whatever, or I'm not going to ask about those things. I'm going to do, I'll talk about this instead. You can negotiate with them a bit, but try not to use your authority position to overcome any kind of doubts they've got. And if you want to know what's good and bad practice, check up your professional ethics. Most organisations, I mentioned here the BPS, that's British Psychological Society, the BSA, British Psychological Association, but other societies have their own ethics, professional bodies have ethics and so on. So look them up and see what's good and bad and what's expected in your particular area of work. So there we are, that's the ethics.